It started like any other day until a black man, calm and composed, crossed paths with a cop who thought his badge made him untouchable. They tried to intimidate him, humiliate him, push him down like so many before, but this time they picked the wrong man. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was the one man who could bring their whole rotten system crashing down. What follows isn't just a fight. It's a reckoning built on years of silence, pride, and injustice, boiling over. And the ending? Let's just say, they never even saw the storm coming. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time you jumped in. Trust me, you'll want to stay to the very last second. The late afternoon sun hung low over St. Townsend 7, Thomas General Hospital, casting long shadows across the gleaming white sidewalks. The hum of everyday life filled the air, ambulances pulling in, doctors in scrubs, hurrying to the next emergency, families waiting anxiously in front lobbies. Nobody noticed the dark patrol car pulling up fast along the curb, engine growling low like a warning. Officer Troy Bennett swung the door open with a jerk and stepped out, boots hitting the pavement hard. His eyes scanned the entrance quickly, already narrowing in suspicion. He wasn't responding to any specific call, just a vague report of a suspicious man lingering near the ER entrance, the kind of thing he didn't need much excuse to escalate. And there he was, standing near the automatic glass doors, was a tall black man in a perfectly pressed navy blue suit. His posture was too confident for Troy's liking, hands calmly clasped in front of him, eyes taking in the crowd without fear, without deference. Something about the man's stillness irritated Troy immediately. In his mind, people like that either submitted or they got put in their place. Troy adjusted his belt, squared his shoulders, and marched toward him with the entitled swagger he wore. Like armor, his hand was already resting near his taser, out of habit, or maybe out of reflex. "Hey! You! What are you doing here?" Troy's voice cut through the bustling noise of the hospital entrance, sharp and accusing. The man turned slowly, not startled, not nervous, just calm. His dark brown eyes met Troy's without flinching, and for a second, something unreadable flickered across his face. But he didn't smile. He didn't cower. He simply stood his ground, his voice low and steady. "I work here." Troy's jaw tightened. He didn't like the man's tone. Too controlled, too sure of himself. "Oh yeah? Doing what exactly?" Troy demanded, stepping closer, crowding into the man's space as if proximity alone would shake loose some kind of submission. The man didn't move back an inch. Instead, he reached slowly into his jacket, pulling out a slim leather wallet and flipping it open to show an ID card. "Hospital security," it said. "Director," it said. But Troy didn't bother to read it closely. In his mind, it didn't matter. Black man, fancy suit, acting like he owned the place. That was all Troy needed to see. He snorted under his breath and waved dismissively at the ID. "Yeah, well, doesn't look like you belong here to me. This is a private facility. We don't need people loitering around, making folks uncomfortable." The man's eyes didn't waver. His voice remained calm, but there was an edge beneath it now. A warning, sharp and quiet. "I suggest you watch your tone." Troy's lip curled. He took another step closer, close enough now that anyone watching would feel the heat of confrontation rising. A few nurses glanced nervously from inside the glass doors, but kept their heads down. No one was going to intervene. Not against a cop. Troy reached out suddenly and grabbed the man's arm, his grip rough, meant to intimidate, meant to remind him who was in charge. The man's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly. He pulled his arm back, not yanking, just a firm, controlled movement, and spoke in a voice that cut through the thickening tension like a blade. "Take your hand off me." The tone wasn't a plea. It was a command. Troy's anger flared. How dare he? How dare this nobody speak to him like that? here, in front of witnesses. His vision narrowed, his heart pounding harder, not from fear, but from pure, seething rage. Without thinking, Troy shoved the man hard in the chest. With an open hand, it was instinctive, ugly, the kind of move he'd used a dozen times before to put people back in their place. The man staggered back half a step, not because he was thrown off balance, but almost as if to give Troy the illusion of winning. His hand smoothed down the front of his suit jacket as he straightened, his face unreadable, breathing steady. And then without warning, without hesitation, the man struck back. It wasn't a wild punch. It wasn't sloppy. It was a precise, controlled movement, shoulder rotating just enough, knuckles landing cleanly against Troy's jaw with the kind of force that came from years of knowing exactly how much to give and exactly how much to hold back. The sound of impact echoed in the air, louder than it should have been. Troy stumbled back, blinking in shock. He tasted blood at the corner of his mouth. His hand flew to his face instinctively, and for a moment, the entire world around them seemed to stop. The man stood there, tall, composed, adjusting his tie like he had just finished straightening a picture on a wall. Around them, a small crowd had begun to gather, hospital staff, patients, even a few visitors clutching coffee cups and cell phones, the kind of scene that would live in whispers long after today. You're under arrest," Troy stammered, reaching for his cuffs, trying to reassert control over a situation that had already spiraled beyond his grasp. But the man didn't move, didn't show a flicker of fear. Instead, he spoke with a calmness that somehow made Troy's heart hammer harder in his chest. "You don't even know who I am, do you?" Troy hesitated, thrown off by the certainty in the man's voice. "You think you're just going to assault a law enforcement officer and walk away?" Troy barked, the words sounding weak, even to his own ears now. The man took a step closer, not aggressive, but commanding, like a tidal wave about to break. "I'm not the one who should be worried about walking away," he said quietly. "But if you want to escalate this, go right ahead." Troy's hand hovered at his belt, torn between fear and ego, instinct and training. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the number of people watching. The number of cell phones pointed his way. For the first time since stepping out of his cruiser, a thread of doubt crept up Troy's spine. The man held his gaze steadily, relentlessly, and in that terrible, stretching silence that followed, a terrible realization began to dawn on Officer Troy Bennett. He had just picked a fight he could never win. Troy's hand trembled slightly as he fumbled for his radio. He squeezed the button hard, his voice crackling through the static, louder than it needed to be, requesting immediate backup, possible assault on an officer. ER entrance. Saint. Thomas General. The words sounded official enough, but even as they left his mouth, Troy knew they didn't carry the weight they should have. He could feel the stares burning into his back. The people watching hadn't seen a man attacked, they'd seen something else. Something far uglier, and they wouldn't forget it. The man who had struck him the man who had defended himself, stood quietly, arms folded across his chest, as if waiting for Troy to make his next move. His silence was deafening. His very presence pressed down on Troy harder than the punch had. The hospital's sliding doors whooshed open again, and two more officers rushed in, hands resting near their weapons, scanning the scene. Their eyes widened when they saw Troy red-faced, one hand clutching his jaw, the other still awkwardly holding the radio. One of them, a younger officer named Michaels, stepped forward. "Bennett, what's the situation?" Troy pointed an accusing finger at Elliot. "He assaulted me. He's resisting. Arrest him." But Michaels hesitated. He glanced at the small crowd gathering nearby, saw the phones in the air, the cautious, almost disgusted looks on some of the nurses' faces. His instincts told him this wasn't the clean, simple bust Troy was making it out to be. The man in the navy suit spoke then, his voice calm. but carrying an authority that wrapped around the room like a rope tightening. "I suggest you get your facts straight before you make another mistake." Michaels blinked, thrown off by the man's tone, the kind of tone you didn't usually hear from someone standing opposite a badge. "Sir," Michaels started carefully, "can you identify yourself fully?" The man didn't even flinch. He reached again into his jacket and pulled out a second ID, this one different, heavier, with the federal insignia embossed in gold. He flipped it open slowly, deliberately. "Elliot Morgan, Director of Security, 1747. Thomas General Hospital. Retired Deputy U.S. Marshal." The words hit the air like a gunshot. Troy's face drained of color so fast it looked almost theatrical. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Michaels took a half-step back, his posture stiffening with sudden, jarring realization. Behind the crowd, whispers started. "That's the new head of security. He used to be a federal marshal." "Oh, Troy's done." Troy heard it all. Every poisonous word wormed its way into his gut and curled there, burning. He took a stumbling step toward Elliot, grasping for any shred of authority he had left. You didn't identify yourself properly," he barked, voice cracking. You provoked this." Elliot didn't move. He didn't need to. Instead, another voice cut in, calm, cool, and carrying more authority than all of Troy's shouting combined. "That's enough, Officer Bennett." Everyone turned, standing just inside the entrance, having come through the other side without anyone noticing, was Detective Susan Grant. She wore plain clothes, her badge clipped casually to her belt, but her stance was unmistakable. She wasn't here to back Troy up. She was here for him. Susan stepped forward slowly, her gaze hard, unflinching. "I suggest you stand down now." Troy opened his mouth to argue, but something in Susan's eyes warned him off. He settled for clenching his fists so tightly, his knuckles whitened. Susan turned to Elliot, nodding once, a small, almost respectful gesture. "Missed. Morgan, are you hurt?" Elliot shook his head slightly. "No, but the situation here needs to be handled properly." Susan's jaw tightened. She turned back to Troy. "We'll handle it. You're relieved. Effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon." Troy's whole body went rigid. "You can't be serious." Susan didn't blink. "Now, officer." The two other officers shifted uncomfortably. Michaels cleared his throat and stepped closer, gently but firmly, taking Troy's arm. For a second, Troy looked like he might fight. His chest heaved, face burning with humiliation, veins standing out in his neck, but the sight of so many eyes recording, watching, judging finally crushed what little resistance he had left. With shaking hands, he pulled his badge from his belt and his sidearm from its holster, handing both over without a word. The clatter of the gun hitting Michaels' open palm echoed through the heavy silence. Susan kept her gaze steady on Troy, her voice dropping low enough that only he and Elliot could really hear her. "You just picked the wrong man at the wrong time," she said. "And trust me, Bennett, you're going to wish this was the worst part of your day." Troy's breathing was ragged now, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. Susan turned her back on him, without waiting for a reply, and faced Elliot again. "We'll need a full statement," she said formally, but there was an undertone of something deeper, an acknowledgement, a warning, maybe even an apology. Elliot inclined his head slightly. Of course, Susan glanced at Michaels and the second officer, Escort Officer Bennett, to his vehicle. He suspended pending full investigation. As they moved to do just that, Troy jerked his arm free for a second, shooting a burning, hateful look at Elliot. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. Elliot didn't answer. He just watched him, steady and silent, like a mountain that couldn't be moved by all the storm and fury in the world. Troy stumbled away, the doors hissing shut behind him, with a finality that seemed almost symbolic. The crowd started to break up slowly. murmurs rippling through them like a current. The cell phones came down. Nurses went back to their rounds. Patients were ushered inside. Visitors resumed their tense vigils, but the air remained thick, heavy with the sense that something monumental had just happened. Susan walked alongside Elliot toward the hospital's private security office. For a moment, they didn't speak. Finally, she broke the silence. "You didn't tell me you were back." Elliot allowed the faintest flicker of a smile. "I wasn't planning on making a big announcement." Susan shook her head, exhaling slowly. "Well, you just made one." Elliot's eyes sharpened as they reached the office door. "Good. Because this place needs a wake-up call." Susan didn't argue. She just nodded grimly. Inside the office, Elliot removed his jacket, carefully hanging it on the back of his chair. He moved with slow, deliberate precision, like someone preparing for a very long, very ugly fight. He wasn't here just to wear a badge and smile for the cameras. He wasn't here to shake hands and pretend everything was fine. He was here because rot had set deep into the foundations of places like St. Thomas General, and sometimes, when the walls are rotten enough, the only way to save the house is to tear it down to the studs. And Troy Bennett? He had just been the first crack in the wall, but he wouldn't be the last, not by a long shot. Troy sat alone inside his cruiser, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned ghost white. The windows were rolled up, but he could still feel the judgment outside, seeping through the glass like smoke. The humiliation was unbearable. The faces in the crowd flashed in his mind over and over, the way they looked at him, not like he was a protector, not like he was a hero, but like he was some thug in uniform who had finally been caught with his hands dirty. He slammed his fist into the dashboard, the impact rattling the radio loose from its cradle. The pain in his hand barely registered over the anger burning inside him. He wasn't going to let it end like this. No way. Troy's breathing was shallow, ragged. His mind spun wildly for options, for some way to flip this narrative back in his favor. Maybe he could claim he didn't know who Elliot was. Maybe he could accuse him of provoking the incident. Hell, maybe he could even find a way to paint himself as the real victim. He fumbled for his phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. "Captain Donnelly." Troy barked. As soon as the line connected, "We got a problem. A big one." On the other end, there was a pause, a long, dangerous silence that Troy knew all too well. "What did you do?" Donnelly's voice was low, sharp as broken glass. Troy swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. "There was a guy at the hospital. Black guy. Suit. Acting suspicious. I engaged standard procedure, and he got physical. I responded. Now they're blowing it way out of proportion." Donnelly sighed heavily, the sound thick with disappointment. "Was he armed?" "No, but he was aggressive, threatening. You have witnesses?" Troy hesitated. Images of the phones raised, the wide eyes, the whispers. They weren't going to be his witnesses. They were going to be his judges. Some, Troy lied. It happened fast. Another long silence. "You picked the wrong target, didn't you?" Donnelly said finally, and there was no pity in his voice, only cold, hard calculation. "I didn't know he was anyone," Troy snapped defensively. "He didn't look like someone important. That's your problem, Bennett. You never know who you're messing with until it's too damn late." The line went dead. Troy let the phone slip from his hand, landing with a dull thud on the passenger seat. His stomach twisted into a knot. Inside the hospital, Elliot sat quietly in the small, sterile conference room off the ER wing, arms folded, his expression unreadable. Susan Grant sat across from him, a legal pad in front of her, a digital recorder already running. "Tell me everything," she said gently. Elliot nodded once and began to recount the events, each word clear, deliberate, leaving no space for confusion or misinterpretation. Susan listened without interruption. her pen occasionally scratching across the paper. She didn't ask leading questions. She didn't push him to dramatize. She just let the truth hang there, bare and heavy. When he finished, she clicked off the recorder. "Thank you," she said simply. Outside the conference room, the hospital halls buzzed like a hive disturbed. Word traveled fast in places like this. It wasn't just that a cop had been suspended, it was the who and the how that had everyone whispering. In a quiet corner near the nurses' station, two younger security officers exchanged nervous glances. "Did you hear? That guy, the one Bennett roughed up, he's the new head of security, and he used to be with the feds," the other added, voice dropping lower. Like serious, high-level stuff. No wonder he handled Bennett like that. The first guard shook his head slowly. "Bennett's done. He just doesn't know it yet." Meanwhile, back in his cruiser, Troy's panic curdled into desperation. He needed a way out. He needed an angle. He scrolled through his contacts again, fingers shaking. Maybe the union rep? Maybe an old friend in internal affairs who owed him a favor? But deep down, even as he grasped at straws, Troy knew the truth. There was no saving this. The story was out, the videos were out. And worse, the man he had laid hands on wasn't some nobody. He was someone with power, with credibility. And that meant Troy wasn't just facing suspension. He was facing termination, maybe even charges. His stomach twisted again, a slow, sick churn that made him lean forward and brace himself against the steering wheel. At that exact moment, across the hospital campus, Elliot stood in front of a wide glass window overlooking the city skyline. Sunset painted everything gold and crimson, but there was no warmth in his eyes as he stared out. Susan stood beside him, silent for a moment, before speaking. "I assume this wasn't how you wanted your first day to go." Elliot gave a small, humorless laugh. "Nothing ever goes the way you plan when you're dealing with rot this deep." Susan nodded thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "Bennett's just the tip of it." Elliot's gaze hardened. "I know. You gonna go after the rest?" Elliot turned slightly, meeting her eyes. "That's why I'm here." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, with a shared understanding, a shared purpose. Susan pulled a small file from her bag and handed it to him. "Something you should see," she said. Elliot opened it. His eyes moved across the pages, incident reports, citizen complaints, internal memos buried deep in the system, names, dates, patterns. The rot wasn't just Troy Bennett. It was a web, a system built to protect men like him, men who thought a badge gave them the right to do whatever they pleased. Elliot closed the file carefully. "I'm going to need access," he said. "Every complaint, every sealed report, every incident they swept under the rug. You'll get it," Susan promised. "But be ready, Elliot. They're not going to go down quietly. I don't expect them to," Elliot said, his voice low and steady. "And I don't plan to either." Outside, the hospital's parking lot was bathed in the soft orange glow of streetlights coming to life one by one. Patients came and went. Ambulances rolled by. Life went on as it always did. But something had shifted, something permanent. Officer Troy Bennett sat slumped in his car, a man already watching the walls close in, and across the hospital campus, Elliot Morgan, silent, patient, relentless, was already laying the foundation for what was coming next. The real battle hadn't even started yet, and when it did, the ones who thought they were untouchable would be the first to fall. Morning light spilled over St. Thomas General Hospital like a fresh coat of paint, but it couldn't hide the cracks that had started to show. Inside, the usual hum of nurses, doctors, and administrative chatter buzzed on, but there was something new underneath it now. A tension, a charged feeling in the air, like everyone was waiting for the next aftershock. Elliot Morgan stood in the main security office, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the bank of monitors displaying every corner of the hospital grounds. He watched calmly as security footage from the night before played on a loop. The confrontation with Officer Troy Bennett caught in crystal clear detail from 3 different angles. The cameras hadn't missed a thing. The aggression, the arrogance, the way Troy had grabbed him, without provocation, the moment Troy's hand had connected in that reckless shove, and then the clean, calculated way Elliot had returned the blow, steady as a heartbeat. Susan Grant stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "They're already buzzing about it online," she said. "Footage leaked early this morning. Probably one of the nurses or visitors. It's everywhere now." Elliot didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the footage as it looped again and again. A brutal dance frozen in time. Finally he spoke, voice low but carrying, "Good." Susan arched an eyebrow. "You're not worried?" Elliot allowed a faint smile, more grim than amused. "About what?" "The truth." Susan shook her head, exhaling slowly. "This is gonna rattle a lot of cages." "That's the point," Elliot said simply. Across the city, in homes and cafes and squad cars, the video spread like wildfire. People watched, rewatched, shared it, commented on it. Some were shocked. Others weren't surprised at all. But everyone felt it. A line had been crossed, and not by Elliot. At the precinct, Officer Troy Bennett sat hunched over a desk, face pale, fists clenched so tightly that the veins stood out on his hands. Around him, the atmosphere was ice cold. Officers he had once joked with, once called friends, now avoided his eyes. Conversation stopped when he entered a room, doors closed quietly behind him. The suspension was already public. And now, with the video exploding across social media, it was only a matter of time before it got worse, much worse. Captain Donnelly called him into his office mid-morning. The door closed behind Troy, with a soft click that sounded way too final. Donnelly didn't bother with pleasantries. "You're officially under departmental investigation," he said, tossing a thick manila envelope onto the desk between them. "Internal affairs." "And that's just the beginning." Troy stared at the envelope, his stomach knotting tighter. "You need to get ahead of this," Donnelly said, voice hard. "Lawyer up. Prepare for a civil suit. Maybe worse." Troy opened his mouth to protest, but Donnelly held up a hand. "Save it. I don't want to hear your excuses. You screwed up, Bennett. And you didn't just screw yourself, you dragged the whole department into this mess." For once, Troy stayed silent. He left Donnelly's office, feeling like a man walking to the gallows. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Elliot stood at the podium in the main conference room, facing a packed crowd of hospital administrators, department heads, and senior security staff. Susan stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the room with sharp, assessing eyes. Elliot didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of what had happened and what was coming hung heavy over everyone. "I know many of you have questions," he began, his tone measured but unmistakably firm. "About last night. About what you saw. About what you heard." He let that sink in for a beat. The footage speaks for itself. Officer Bennett abused his authority. He escalated without cause. He used force where none was justified. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one interrupted. Elliot's gaze swept the room. And he's not the only one. Silence. You could hear a pin drop. For too long, there's been a pattern here. A pattern of harassment, profiling, discrimination not just by outside law enforcement, but from within these very walls. It ends now. A ripple of unease passed through the room. A few faces turned pale. Others stiffened, trying to mask their anxiety. Elliot continued, his voice calm, relentless. "I'm not here to protect reputations. I'm not here to sweep things under the rug. I'm here to expose it, to clean it out. And if that makes some of you uncomfortable, good." A slow, low murmur started to build again. Nervous glances bouncing across the room. Someone near the back, an older security supervisor, cleared his throat. "Mr. Morgan." With all due respect, are you planning a full review? Elliot turned his gaze to the man, eyes steady. I'm planning an investigation, full access. Every complaint, every incident, every report that's been quietly shelved or ignored. If you've got something to hide, now's the time to come clean. The man swallowed hard and sat back in his chair. Susan watched it all quietly, noting who fidgeted, who sweated, who avoided eye contact. Elliot was drawing the lines in the sand, and everyone in the room knew it. After the meeting ended, Susan caught up to Elliot in the hallway. You think they'll come forward voluntarily? She asked. Elliot smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. No, but they'll start making mistakes. That's when we move across town. At the precinct, the news broke officially. Press releases, statements, public apologies that sounded rehearsed and hollow. The chief of police stood grim-faced at a podium, reading carefully from a teleprompter, assuring the public that the department took these allegations seriously and was committed to full transparency. It was too little, too late. The community wasn't buying it. Outside St. Thomas Hospital, a small but growing group of protesters began to gather holding signs, chanting slogans, accountability, now, justice for all, no badge, above the law. Inside, Elliot watched them through a window, his reflection superimposed over the faces of those demanding change. Susan stepped beside him, folding her arms. This is just the beginning, she said. Elliot nodded once. I know, down the hall. The hospital administrator, a man who had once ruled with unchecked authority, paced nervously in his office. He knew what was coming. Everyone did. Troy Bennett's fall was just the first crack in the dam. And Elliot Morgan was standing at the center of it, ready to bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. The air inside St. Thomas Hospital had shifted from tense to electric. The murmurs in the hallways were no longer just about Officer Troy Bennett. They were about what was coming next, about who else might be dragged into the light, about how much longer the walls around them could hold before the cracks split wide open. In his office, Elliot Morgan sat at his desk, sorting through files with a steady, relentless rhythm. Each folder he opened told another piece of the same ugly story, small infractions brushed aside, formal complaints that disappeared into the administrative void, names that kept popping up over and over again. Susan Grant leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching him. You're not pulling punches, are you? She said. Elliot didn't look up. Never have, never will. Susan pushed off the doorframe and stepped closer, dropping a new file on top of the growing pile. This just came in. An anonymous tip. Says Officer Bennett wasn't acting alone. Says there are others. Higher up, Elliot finally looked up, his eyes sharp and steady. How high? Susan shrugged, but the tightness around her mouth betrayed the seriousness of it. Hospital board, city council connections, even whispers about the mayor's office. Elliot closed the folder slowly, considering the weight of that information. Of course, he said quietly. Rot like this doesn't start at the bottom. Susan glanced out the window, where the protesters outside had doubled in size since that morning. Their chants carried faintly on the wind, growing louder, more insistent. You think you can take them all on? She asked. Elliot stood, slipping on his jacket with slow, deliberate movements. I'm not here to pick a fight, he said. I'm here to finish one. Word of the impending investigation spread through the hospital like wildfire. The ones who had something to hide moved quickly, files disappeared. Emails got scrubbed, conversations hushed. But Elliot anticipated all of it. He wasn't new to this game. He had played it before, at a much higher level, against people who had far more to lose, and he knew exactly how to spot desperation. Late that afternoon, Susan received a message on her encrypted phone, a meet request. Anonymous. Location nearby. High risk. High reward. It could be a trap, but it could also be the break they needed. She didn't hesitate. At dusk, Susan pulled into an abandoned parking lot 2 blocks from the hospital. She kept the engine running, eyes scanning the perimeter. A lone figure stepped out from the shadows, hood pulled low. Susan kept her hand near her sidearm, but cracked the window enough to hear. "You got information?" she said, her voice low. The figure nodded. "About Bennett, about the board, about everything." The figure slid an envelope through the gap. Inside, Susan could already see it: photographs, copies of emails, handwritten notes, evidence, real evidence. But the figure didn't linger. They disappeared back into the shadows before Susan could even get a good look at their face. She locked the doors, heart pounding, and peeled out of the lot, tires squealing against the cracked asphalt. Back at the hospital, Elliot was waiting. Susan burst through the door, eyes blazing. "You're not going to believe this," she said, tossing the envelope onto his desk. Elliot opened it carefully. One glance was all it took. Bribery. Witness intimidation. Coordinated cover-ups involving senior hospital officials and members of the city council. And buried inside, a damning email chain implicating Troy Bennett, directly showing he had been used as a blunt instrument more than once to silence or intimidate problem employees and patients who didn't fit the image. Elliot leaned back in his chair, the weight of it all settling over him. "They were using him," he said. "Using him to keep their house of cards standing." Susan nodded grimly. "And he was too arrogant, too stupid to realize he was disposable." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about one bad cop anymore. This was a machine, a system, and they had just found the blueprints. As night fell, Elliot and Susan laid out their plan. They would go public, not just through internal channels, not just behind closed doors. They would hold a press conference, release everything: names, evidence, the whole rotten structure exposed for everyone to see. There was no turning back now. At midnight, Elliot stood alone outside the hospital, looking up at the dark windows, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He thought about all the people who had been hurt, all the voices that had been silenced, all the trust that had been broken. He thought about the oath he had taken a lifetime ago, the promise to protect, to serve, not power, not institutions, people, real people. And he knew no matter how ugly this was going to get, no matter how many enemies it made him, it was the right thing to do. The only thing to do. Back inside, Troy Bennett sat slumped in a plastic chair outside Internal Affairs, waiting to be called in for his formal interview. His hands were clammy, his mouth dry. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He knew he was done, but he didn't know just how bad it was about to get, because by morning, the world wouldn't just know about what he had done to Elliot Morgan. They'd know about everything. And Troy Bennett wouldn't just be a disgraced cop. He'd be a symbol of everything that had gone wrong and everything that was finally being torn down. The morning sun rose over the city like a spotlight, casting a cold, unforgiving glare on everything it touched. At St. Thomas Hospital, the atmosphere was electric, almost trembling, as word spread like wildfire. Today was the day. Elliot Morgan stood in front of the hospital's main entrance. A small wooden podium hastily set up at the top of the steps. Microphones bristled in front of him, like an army of silver bayonets. A crowd had gathered, thicker than anyone expected. Reporters jockeyed for position, cameras rolled. Protesters waved their signs higher. Even staff from inside the hospital pressed up against the windows, trying to catch a glimpse. Susan Grant stood a few feet behind Elliot, arms crossed, her eyes sweeping the crowd for any sign of trouble. She could feel the tension, the fear, the hope, all of it mixing into something volatile. Elliot waited until the crowd quieted, until the only sounds were the distant blare of sirens and the click of cameras. Then he spoke. "My name is Elliot Morgan," he said, his voice steady, carrying easily across the open space. "I am the Director of Security for St. Thomas General Hospital. I am a retired Deputy U.S. Marshal, and today I am here not just to talk about what happened between me and Officer Troy Bennett." He paused, letting the name hang in the air, letting people absorb it. "I'm here to talk about a system." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The reporters leaned forward, pens poised, lenses tightening their focus. "For too long," Elliot continued, "there have been abuses of power within these walls. People mistreated, threatened, silenced, and not by accident, but by design." He reached into a folder and held up a thick sheaf of documents for everyone to see. "These are the receipts," he said. "Emails, photos, testimonies, proof that Officer Bennett's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was encouraged, protected, and weaponized by those who valued their image more than human lives." Gasps rippled through the reporters. Flashbulbs popped like firecrackers. Elliot laid the documents carefully on the podium. "And it goes higher," he said, his voice dropping, almost vibrating with the weight of it. "Members of the hospital board, city officials, people who thought they could operate in the dark, shielded by status and silence." Susan caught the sharp intake of breath from several members of the crowd. She scanned their faces, some in shock, some in fury, some already pulling out phones, texting, making calls. The ripple had started, and it was about to turn into a tidal wave. Inside the hospital, in a corner office with blinds hastily closed, the hospital administrator watched the live feed on his laptop, a bead of sweat sliding down his temple. Beside him, two senior board members whispered fiercely, arguing about damage control, legal options, public relations strategies. But it was too late. The story was out, and there was no stuffing it back into the bottle. Outside, Elliot wasn't finished. "I have filed formal complaints with the Department of Justice," he said. "There will be criminal investigations, civil suits, reviews of hospital practices, city contracts, police department oversight." He looked directly into the cameras now, into the living rooms and kitchens of every home where people were watching. "This ends now." The crowd erupted, some cheering, some shouting questions, all of them swept up in the momentum. Elliot stepped back, letting the press surge forward to get statements, interviews, anything they could grab. Susan moved in quickly, guiding him down the steps, cutting through the chaos. They made it back inside the hospital, into the relative quiet of the security wing. Before Susan spoke, "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice low but intense. Elliot nodded. "They were never going to fix it themselves," he said. "They had to be forced." Susan watched him for a moment, then gave a short nod of her own. "Then let's finish what we started." By noon, the story had gone national. News vans lined the street, in front of the hospital. Commentators on every major network weighed in, some cautiously supportive, others frothing with outrage. Protests outside the hospital swelled into the hundreds, spilling into the streets, blocking traffic. Handmade signs bobbed above the crowd. "Justice for all. We stand with Elliot. No more cover-ups." Meanwhile, at the precinct, Troy Bennett sat alone in a gray interrogation room, facing two stern-faced internal affairs officers. A cheap plastic clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking every agonizing second. Troy knew the moment he saw their faces that it was over. There was no sympathy in their eyes, no deals being offered, only cold, merciless procedure. "You are being charged with excessive use of force, dereliction of duty, and civil rights violations," one of the officers said, sliding papers across the table. Troy stared down at the documents, the words blurring together. "You have the right to an attorney," the officer continued, voice monotone. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Troy said nothing. What was there to say? The weight of his actions, his arrogance, his years of getting away with it, it all crashed down on him now, suffocating, inescapable. Back at the hospital, Elliot wasn't slowing down. He met with city officials, hospital board members who were now desperate to save their own skins. He laid out demands, comprehensive policy reforms, independent oversight, mandatory bias training, and the immediate termination of anyone implicated in the cover-up. Some protested. Some tried to negotiate. Elliot didn't budge. "This isn't a negotiation," he said simply. "This is a reckoning." The mayor, sensing the shifting winds, publicly praised Elliot's bravery and promised sweeping changes. But Elliot didn't trust pretty words and handshakes. He wanted signatures. He wanted commitments in writing. And he got them, because they had no choice anymore. The city was watching. The country was watching. And Elliot Morgan had made damn sure that the light wasn't going to turn away until every ugly secret was dragged into it. That night, long after the cameras had packed up and the protesters had gone home, Elliot stood again at the window overlooking the city skyline. Susan joined him, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands. "You think it'll stick?" she asked. Elliot took the coffee, savoring the warmth in his hands before answering. "It better," he said, "because if they think they can wait us out, if they think people will forget, they're wrong." Susan smiled slightly. "You ever get tired of fighting?" Elliot smiled too. A real one this time. Not when it's for the right reasons. Outside, the city stretched out before them, battered, bruised, but maybe, just maybe, beginning to heal. And Elliot Morgan knew this was just the beginning. Because justice wasn't a single act. It was a lifetime's work, and he wasn't going anywhere. The days that followed felt like a storm with no center. St. Thomas Hospital became ground zero, not just for protests and media vans, but for something deeper, something nobody could stop now. The city buzzed with anger, fear, and a strange new energy. The people had tasted the truth, and they weren't letting go. The mayor's office scrambled to stay ahead of the outrage. The hospital board issued panicked statements full of buzzwords and hollow promises. And behind closed doors, the ones who had the most to lose began to plot. Elliot Morgan knew it was coming. He had seen it before, in different cities, under different names. When power felt threatened, it didn't roll over and surrender. It dug in. It lashed out. Late one evening, Susan Grant burst into Elliot's office, face grim, a manila envelope clutched in her hand. "You need to see this," she said, her voice tight. Elliot closed the file he had been reading and leaned forward. Susan dropped the envelope on his desk and stepped back like it might bite. Inside were copies of anonymous tips, half-truths, and twisted accusations all aimed at Elliot, claims that he had falsified reports during his time as a U.S. Marshal, rumors that he had used excessive force, whispers that he had been forced into early retirement. Elliot flipped through the pages slowly, his face unreadable. "They're trying to dirty you up," Susan said, her fists clenched. "They're scared, Elliot. They can't touch the evidence, so they're coming after you." Elliot didn't flinch, didn't curse. He simply closed the file and set it aside. "I expected this." Susan stared at him. "Doesn't it bother you?" she asked. "That they'll lie, twist everything you've done, everything you've fought for." Elliot leaned back, his voice low, steady. "If they're coming for me, it means I'm winning." But inside, he felt the pressure tightening, because he knew the game they were playing now wasn't about facts. It was about perception, about creating just enough doubt, just enough confusion, that people would start to hesitate, would start to wonder if Elliot Morgan was really the man they thought he was. Across town, in a sleek, high-rise conference room overlooking the river, a group of powerful men and women sat around a long table, sipping expensive coffee, their faces grave. At the head of the table, A man in an expensive tailored suit spoke softly, his voice oily and smooth. "He's destabilizing everything we've built," the man said. "The contracts, the relationships, the image. If he succeeds, it won't just be a few jobs lost. It'll be the whole damn machine." Another man, gray-haired and stone-faced, leaned forward. "Can we buy him off?" The man in the suit shook his head. "Not a chance. He's a true believer." A third voice, sharper, more dangerous, cut in. "Then we discredit him. Make the public question his motives. Make him the villain. Use the media. Use the unions. Make it so messy, so ugly, that he loses the moral high ground." The others nodded grimly. The plan was set, and Elliot Morgan was about to find himself fighting not just corruption, but a war for his very name. The first shots came the next morning. A breaking news story hit the airwaves. New allegations surface about hospital whistleblower. The anchors wore concerned faces, repeating phrases like serious questions and unanswered past misconduct. They invited talking heads to debate whether Elliot had a hidden agenda, whether he was using the scandal to boost his own career. Old photographs surfaced, taken wildly out of context. Footage of Elliot arresting violent suspects was framed as examples of brutality. By noon, the hashtags were trending. "Who is Elliot Morgan?" Hashtag "Too Good to Be True." Hashtag "Another Dirty Cop." Susan slammed her hand down on Elliot's desk, furious. "This is garbage. Lies." Elliot remained calm. "They're doing what they always do," he said. "When they can't kill the truth, they try to kill the messenger." Susan paced the room, seething. "You have to fight back. You have to go on TV. Hold another press conference. Set the record straight." Elliot shook his head slowly. "No, that's what they want. They want me on the defensive. They want me explaining, apologizing, chasing my own tail." Susan stopped pacing, staring at him. "Then what are you going to do?" Elliot's eyes hardened. "I'm going to stay on offense." That afternoon, Elliot doubled down. Instead of defending himself, he released another trove of evidence, more documents, more emails, more proof of corruption so overwhelming that even the most cynical reporters couldn't ignore it. And then he did something nobody expected. He sat down for an exclusive interview with the most respected journalist in the city, a woman known for her no-nonsense style and ruthless commitment to the truth. The interview aired live that night. Elliot didn't dodge a single question. When asked about the rumors from his past, he answered calmly, directly. "When you stand against powerful people, they will always find a way to attack you," he said. "But my record speaks for itself. My life speaks for itself. I'm not perfect, but I have never betrayed the people I swore to protect." When asked why he was fighting this battle now, when he could have walked away, Elliot leaned forward, voice low but burning with intensity. "Because if I don't, who will?" The interview was raw, honest, unflinching, and it hit like a thunderclap. Public opinion, which had wavered under the smear campaign, swung back with brutal force. The hashtags changed. Stand with Elliot, hashtag justice over lies, hashtag truth matters. In the days that followed, more hospital employees came forward, nurses, technicians, even junior doctors telling their own stories of harassment, discrimination, retaliation. The machine was collapsing under its own weight. Elliot didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He kept working, quiet, relentless, unstoppable, because he knew the war wasn't over. Not yet. Not until every single piece of the rotten structure was torn down. And even then, he would keep standing, because that's what justice demanded. And Elliot Morgan had made a promise to himself, to the people watching, to the ones who had been silenced for too long. He wasn't just fighting for them, he was fighting with them. And he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The city hadn't seen a day like this in decades. By noon, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, citizens, activists, all of them buzzing with the same restless, electric energy. Word had spread fast. There was going to be a statement, not from the hospital board, not from the mayor's office, from someone nobody expected, from a man who hadn't spoken publicly in years. Retired police chief Richard Bennett, Troy's father. Inside a cramped, wood-paneled press room, Elliot Morgan stood near the back, arms folded, watching the chaos unfold. Susan Grant stood beside him, silent, tense. "You really think he'll show?" Susan asked under her breath. Elliot's face was unreadable. "He has to." Susan scanned the crowd. If Richard Bennett really came, if he really spoke, it would change everything, because Richard wasn't just any former cop. He was a living symbol in this city, respected by some, feared by others, but known by all. His word could either crack the system wide open, or seal it shut tighter than ever. At exactly 1:00 p.m., the door at the front of the room opened, and there he was. Richard Bennett was older now, his hair gone almost completely white, his face lined with the weight of a lifetime spent enforcing the law. He wore a simple gray suit, no medals, no honors pinned to his chest, just a plain black tie and a face carved from stone. The room went silent as he approached the podium. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at the reporters. He looked down at the small stack of prepared notes in his hand for a long, heavy moment. Then he set them aside. When he spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, but every word carried like a hammer hitting steel. "I served this city for over 30 years, he began. "I wore the badge. I taught others what it was supposed to mean, and I believed in it." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but no one interrupted. "But somewhere along the way," Richard continued, his eyes lifting now, scanning the faces in the room, "some of us forgot." He paused, the weight of those words sinking deep. "My son," he said, the syllables hard to force out, "was one of them." Susan stiffened beside Elliot. You could hear the room holding its breath. Richard's jaw tightened visibly, but he pressed on. Troy was raised to believe that the badge was a symbol of service, of sacrifice, of duty. Somewhere, he lost that, and for that failure, I hold myself accountable too. The camera's whirred, microphones pushed forward, reporters leaning in as if afraid to miss a single word. "What Troy did," Richard said, voice rough with emotion, "was wrong. What others allowed to happen around him was wrong. And the only way forward, the only way this city heals, is by facing that truth." He stepped back slightly from the podium, gripping the edges with both hands, his knuckles white. "I do not stand with my son in what he did," he said, voice breaking slightly now. "I stand with those he hurt. I stand with those who demand better." The room exploded into noise, shouted questions, flashing lights, people scrambling to capture every second of it. But Richard didn't answer any questions. He simply stepped away from the microphone, straightened his jacket, and walked out without another word. Elliot watched him go, his expression still, but something flickered behind his eyes. Respect, sadness, maybe even a touch of pity, because Richard Bennett hadn't just condemned his own son, he had condemned a culture that had protected men like Troy for far too long. Susan let out a long breath. "Well," she said softly, "there's no walking that back," Elliot nodded. He just set the fire himself. Outside, the streets filled with renewed protests only now. The chants were louder, fiercer, more unified. Signs waved in the air. No more silence. Fathers for justice. One badge, one standard. Inside the courthouse, Elliot met briefly with Richard Bennett. Away from the cameras, they stood facing each other in a quiet hallway, two men shaped by different wars, different battles, but bound now by a shared reckoning. "You didn't have to do that," Elliot said quietly. Richard's mouth twisted into a grim smile. "Yeah, I did," he said. "We all do." There was a long silence between them, heavy with things neither could say out loud. Finally, Richard reached out, offering his hand. Elliot took it without hesitation. No cameras captured the moment. No reporters recorded it. But it mattered, maybe more than anything else that day. By nightfall, Troy Bennett's name was no longer just a headline. It was a symbol, a warning, a reckoning. Troy himself sat alone in a holding cell, staring at the cold concrete wall, the roar of the protests faint but unmistakable through the tiny barred window. He had seen the footage. He had seen the press conference. He had heard his father's words. And in the crushing, lonely silence that followed, he realized something he had never understood before. There would be no redemption bought with lies, no salvation earned through anger, only the long, painful road of facing the truth. Elliot stood again that night by the hospital window, watching the city pulse with energy far below. Susan brought him a coffee, setting it quietly beside him. "You did it," she said. Elliot shook his head slowly. "We started it," he corrected. "There's a difference." Susan smiled faintly. "And you're going to keep going, aren't you?" Elliot nodded. "Until the walls are torn down, until the ground is clean, until the next generation doesn't have to fight this same damn battle." Outside, the protest chants rose louder into the night air, and Elliot Morgan, scarred but unbroken, stood ready for whatever came next, because he knew that real change never came easy. It was fought for, it was bled for, it was earned inch by inch, truth by brutal truth, and he wasn't going anywhere, not until the job was finished, not until justice had its due. The courtroom was heavy with silence. Rows of hard wooden benches were packed with people reporters scribbling in notepads, citizens who had followed every headline, officers in plain clothes sitting stiff-backed near the exits. All of them had come for one thing, to see what would happen to Troy Bennett. Troy sat at the defendant's table, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. He wore a dark suit that hung a little loose on his frame now, his hair too neatly combed, as if he thought he could still present the image of a man in control. But nothing could hide the tightness in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands. Across the aisle, Elliot Morgan sat quietly among the public rows, a silent observer. He hadn't come to gloat. He hadn't come for revenge. He came because justice required witnesses. It required someone to stand there and see it through to the bitter end. The judge entered, a stern woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. "All rise." The room stood as one. As the proceedings began, Troy's attorney launched into a desperate defense, talking about years of service, the stress of the job, the misunderstandings that led to Elliot's assault. She framed Troy as a man overwhelmed, pushed too far. Elliot listened without reaction. He had heard it all before. The tired excuses, the pleas for sympathy. But the evidence was a tidal wave that no amount of spin could hold back. Video footage, testimonies, internal reports. The mountain of misconduct that had been hidden for years was now laid bare for everyone to see. Troy sat there, his face crumbling piece by piece, as each new exhibit was introduced. Each new witness stood up and told their truth. Nurses describing how Troy intimidated patients of color, hospital staff recounting how he turned simple security checks into humiliating shakedowns. A mother's voice breaking as she described how Troy had threatened her teenage son for being in the wrong hallway. It was brutal, it was ugly, and it was unstoppable. Susan Grant sat a few seats over from Elliot, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression carved from stone. She caught Elliot's eye once, gave him the faintest of nods. They were here. They had made it this far, but it wasn't over yet. When the prosecution rested, the judge turned to Troy. "Mr. Bennett, you have the right to address the court before sentencing. Is there anything you wish to say?" For a long moment, Troy didn't move. The courtroom waited. The city waited. Finally, Troy rose to his feet. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "One," he started, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I spent my whole life thinking the badge meant something, that it made me better than the people I arrested, that it gave me the right to do what I wanted." He swallowed hard, eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance. But it didn't. The room was dead silent. Troy's shoulders sagged, the last of his arrogance slipping away. "I forgot the badge was supposed to mean service. I forgot it was supposed to mean respect. I forgot the people." He drew in a shaky breath. "I hurt people who trusted me. I hurt people who needed protection. And I hurt the ones who believed that justice meant something real." He finally turned his eyes toward Elliot. "I hurt you." The words weren't loud. They weren't dramatic, but they were real. And for the first time, Elliot saw something in Troy's face that hadn't been there before. Shame. Regret. The judge listened, her face unreadable. When Troy finished, he sat down heavily, like a man collapsing under the weight of his own choices. The judge called a short recess before sentencing. The courtroom buzzed as people filed into the hallways, voices low and intense. Elliot stayed seated, staring straight ahead. Susan leaned over, whispering, "You believe him?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "It doesn't matter what I believe. The damage is done." Outside, the protests had grown even larger. The courthouse steps were a sea of signs and chanting voices. But there was a different tone now, not just anger, but something more layered, a hunger for real change, a refusal to be satisfied with just one man's downfall. Back inside, as the crowd settled again, the judge returned to the bench. She didn't waste words. She spoke of duty, of trust broken, of the impact Troy's actions had on individuals and the community as a whole. And then she passed sentence. Troy Bennett was stripped of his badge permanently. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, without parole. There were gasps, some of shock, some of relief. Troy closed his eyes briefly, as the words fell over him like a final curtain. As officers approached to escort him out, Troy hesitated. Then, without being prompted, he turned and faced the room one last time. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all. He was a man who had built his life on the wrong foundations, and now he would spend years learning what it meant to rebuild from nothing. Elliot rose quietly as Troy was led away. Susan fell in step beside him. "That's it," she said. "It's done." Elliot shook his head slowly. "It started," he corrected. "It's not done. Not yet." As they stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, the crowd outside erupted into cheers, into chants, into raw, aching hope. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, Elliot Morgan allowed himself to feel something warm bloom in his chest. Not pride, not victory, but possibility. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, they had cracked something open that couldn't be closed again, and that, maybe, just maybe, the future would be better because they had refused to stay silent, because they had stood and fought and never, not once, backed down. The days after the sentencing moved like slow, heavy tides across the city. The anger was still there. So was the hope. But now, woven between them, was something new, something harder to define, a sense of reckoning. A sense that the ground had shifted, even if only by an inch. At St. Thomas Hospital, things didn't magically fix themselves overnight. The hallways were still crowded, the patients still waited too long, and the tensions that had simmered for years didn't just vanish. But you could feel it. In small ways, in real ways. A nurse who used to lower her gaze when an officer passed now looked them square in the eye. A young black orderly, who had once moved silently through the halls, now walked a little taller. Change wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, relentless, just like Elliot Morgan. Elliot stood outside the newly installed security training room, watching through the glass as the first session got underway. The room was packed, new recruits, veteran guards, even visiting officers from the local precinct, all seated in neat rows, listening intently as an instructor spoke about bias, about accountability, about the real meaning of the badge. Susan Grant appeared beside him, a fresh cup of coffee in her hand. "They showed up," she said, surprised. "They're scared," Elliot said quietly. "That's good." "Fear's a good place to start." Susan studied him for a moment. "You ever think about slowing down?" she asked. "Taking a real break." Elliot gave a faint smile. "After 30 years? Slowing down would kill me faster than any bullet." Susan laughed softly, then grew serious. "You know," she said, "you changed things here." Elliot didn't answer right away. He watched a young woman in the classroom, a rookie officer, raise her hand, her face earnest, unafraid. He watched the instructor nod, engage her, listen. He watched the future shifting, inch by stubborn inch. "I didn't do it alone," Elliot said finally. Susan nodded. "No one ever does." That afternoon, Elliot found himself walking the hospital grounds. Through familiar paths lined with manicured lawns and benches, he passed families waiting anxiously, doctors on smoke breaks, kids chasing each other around benches. Life. Still messy. Still imperfect. Still beautiful. At the far end of the grounds, near the oldest wing of the hospital, Elliot found a quiet spot shaded by an old oak tree. He sat down on the bench there, feeling the solid weight of the wood beneath him, the way the roots of the tree must have dug deep, holding steady through storms and seasons. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the city wash over him. Footsteps approached. When he opened his eyes, he saw Richard Bennett. The retired chief moved carefully now, each step measured, but his presence was still undeniable. He lowered himself onto the bench beside Elliot, without a word. For a long time, they sat there in silence, two men linked by blood and battle, regret and resolve. Finally, Richard spoke. "I wanted to hate you," he said. At first, Elliot didn't react. "I wanted to blame you," Richard continued, voice rough, "for everything, for my son, for the mess, for making me face it." He paused, his hands resting heavily on his knees. "But you didn't create it," Richard said. "You just refused to keep pretending it wasn't there." Elliot turned his head slightly, meeting the old man's tired eyes. "Sometimes," Elliot said, "the hardest part isn't fighting the system. It's admitting we helped build it." Richard nodded slowly. Yeah, they sat there for a while longer, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun slipped lower in the sky. When Richard finally rose to leave, he placed a firm hand on Elliot's shoulder. "Don't stop," he said, "no matter what it costs." Then he walked away, his figure growing smaller with each step, until he disappeared around a corner. Elliot sat there for a long time after that, not because he needed to, because he wanted to, because sometimes you have to sit with the weight of what's been lost before you can carry the weight of what's still left to save. As night fell, Elliot returned to his office. The hospital quieted down, the halls dimmer, the world outside wrapped in the soft hum of streetlights. He sat at his desk, flipping through reports not of complaints this time, but of commendations, guards stepping in when a patient was mistreated, officers intervening before a situation escalated, small victories, tiny fractures in a wall that had once seemed unbreakable. And Elliot smiled, a real smile, not because it was over. It would never be over, but because now, every day, every inch of ground gained, every voice heard, every injustice challenged, it mattered. It made a difference, even if it was slow, even if it hurt, especially because it hurt. Outside, the hospital's new security motto gleamed under the entry lights. Protect. Serve. Respect. Simple words. Heavy promises. Elliot leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the day settle over him. He thought about all the battles still ahead, all the nights still to come. And he welcomed them, because in a world that wanted easy answers and quick fixes, Elliot Morgan had learned a deeper truth. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, a fight you chose every single day. And tonight, like every night before and every night still to come, Elliot Morgan chose to stand, to fight, to believe. And he would keep standing, no matter how long it took, because some things, dignity, honor, truth, were worth fighting for. Always. This story isn't just about one officer, or one hospital, or even one city. It's about what happens when good people choose to stand up, no matter how broken the system seems. It reminds us that real justice doesn't come from anger alone. It comes from courage, from perseverance, from a quiet refusal to give up on what's right. Elliot Morgan taught us that change is slow, it's uncomfortable, it costs something, but every inch we move forward matters for ourselves, for our communities, and for the generations coming after us. And maybe the biggest lesson is this: it's never too late to do the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. Because real strength isn't about winning, it's about standing tall when it would be easier to walk away. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power we all have to make a difference, we invite you to like this video, share it with someone who believes in standing up for what's right, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us all, no matter our age, that it's never too late to be part of something bigger than ourselves. Thank you for watching, and thank you for believing that justice still matters